Imagine standing at the lip of the Nile at dusk, the river stretching like a dark artery through a landscape of papyrus and mud brick, and feeling, before you can form it into words, that something intimate and secret once flowed as surely through those cities as the water itself. This is a story about what was done behind temple doors and palace thresholds, about rites that bound bodies to belief, and about how later hands would tuck those traces away. Content warning: this narrative discusses sexual violence, ritualized exploitation, and the abuse of children in ancient contexts. Passages dealing directly with those topics treat them in clinical, non-graphic terms. If you find this account worth exploring, stay with it to the end. If it moves you, like and comment below so the conversation can continue. Ancient Egypt framed life around cycles, of the Nile, of sowing and harvest, of birth and death. The river was not merely a resource, but a cosmology. The currents and the floods were read as the visible breath of forces that governed fertility and order. Within that worldview, sexuality could be cast as more than private. It became a material conduit for cosmic renewal. Pharaohs were portrayed as guarantors of balance, their potency a civic attribute. Temples stood not only as houses of gods, but as calibrated theaters where human bodies, substances, and gestures interfaced with myth. Wine and beer, everyday staples, were also ritual tools, lowering inhibitions and enabling states of altered consciousness that communities read as possession or divine visitation. Thresholds into inner sanctums thus became liminal sites, places where the ordinary and the sacred inverted. To frame what happened inside those thresholds, one must combine material traces with the texts that survived and with the educated conjectures of scholars. Archaeological analyses indicate specialized rooms in certain temples, enclosed chambers lined with decorated reliefs, small adjoining cells, basins, and channels that suggest functions beyond the purely liturgical. Papyrus fragments, some medical in nature and others more enigmatic, refer to fertility rites, devotional obligations, and the allocation of temple labor, including the dedication of children and of domestic slaves to temple service. Forensic study of some mummies has revealed signs of malnutrition, repeated injuries, and stress markers that fit patterns of chronic exploitation. Where mortuary inscriptions praise divine favor and immortality, osteological data sometimes tell a different story. Short lives, high child mortality in certain strata, and bodily evidence of hard labor. Scholars caution that these findings are partial and regionally variable. Some studies speak of clusters of evidence in particular periods or locales rather than a universal system. What follows are reconstructions, plausible, composite vignettes built from those materials, offered not as literal reportage, but as human-scale ways to imagine how structures and beliefs touched flesh and fate. The embalmer, reconstruction, moved through a long, cool laboratory chamber where the smell of natron sat like dust in the air. He had been trained to measure, to separate, to name every stage of decay and resurrection. His hands learned the anatomy of silence, how to close eyes and fold fingers to fashion a face that would carry a name beyond the grave. On the day he was asked to prepare a child taken into temple service, he watched traces of a life shrink into linen. He recorded the weight, the abrasions, the stunted growth that made the child's bones speak of hunger. The embalmer kept a ledger of treatments and payments. He also kept a memory, because he had no place else to put what he had seen. In his ledger, he noted a mark on the pelvis that matched patterns he had seen on other bodies designated as temple dependents, signs interpreted by some analysts as indicators of chronic coercion and by others as the result of heavy physical labor in a cramped domestic context. He read the texts that ordered dedications, and he had learned to separate the legalese of offering from the human cost that rarely surfaced in official registers. A temple child, reconstruction, remembered how words became the first layer of containment. From infancy, ritual phrases were taught as routine, prayers, hymns, the names of gods and functions. The child's earliest memories were not of play, but of being moved from one house to another, assessed by women with precise hands who measured teeth and limbs and spoke of offerings to be made. The child was taught to expect reward if obedience pleased the temple and punishment if it did not, both social disciplines that bound young bodies tightly to institutional rhythms. Some children were trained in music and service. Others pressed into tasks that left long shadows on bones discovered in later digs. Later, in adulthood, survivors, those rare few who left the temple precincts alive, carried complex aftermaths. Somatic complaints catalogued by medical papyri, a sense of dislocated kinship, and stories of rites that could not be translated simply as devotion. Domestic slaves and dependents constituted another axis. Household records and wage lists preserved on thin papyrus strips show payments in grain, new clothes, and beer, compensation that, for many, was barely sufficient. In houses attached to temple complexes, the line between domestic service and ritual function was porous. A woman who cooked offerings might also be listed among temple workers when state ceremonies loomed. A youth who swept an inner court might be recorded as a temple attendant. The archaeological footprint, storage jars, traces of tethering in certain cells, wear patterns on thresholds, suggests that mobility was limited and surveillance constant. Here, control was mundane rather than theatrical. Schedules, rations, punishment, and praise braided together to maintain compliance. Material evidence anchors these narratives. In certain necropolises, mummies show enamel wear from coarse diets and calcified lesions associated with repeated physical strain. In other graves, careful placement of amulets and specific inscriptions hint at ritualized roles during life. Papyri with medical recipes and forensic notes, fragmentary as they are, refer to treatments for injuries sustained in the course of service. Inscriptions on temple walls celebrate fertility and harmony, but these idealized images coexisted with administrative records. Documents that record allocations of children and labor to sanctuaries. Archaeologists and historians assemble such fragments like a mosaic, whose missing tiles complicate any single interpretation. It is important to stress that many of these traces are contested. Some scholars read them as evidence of systemic, ritualized exploitation. Others urge caution, warning against conflating ritual roles with abuse without more context. The question of how later collectors and curators treated these materials opens another chapter. By the 19th century, European interest in Egypt had become voracious and commercial. Archaeological expeditions, private collections, and nascent museums curated narratives that fit contemporary sensibilities. Documented cases exist in which explicit materials, images, figurines, papyri with erotic content, or with frank references to practices now considered abusive, were withheld from public view, refiled into private drawers, translated with euphemism, or quietly sold. Some Victorian archaeologists and collectors openly declared certain finds indecent for general audiences. Others simply allowed private pressings of texts or sketches to circulate among chosen scholars. Later museum displays tended to sanitize. Reliefs were shown with damaged panels omitted. Papyri translated to emphasize myth instead of the practical obligations of temple households. And storage rooms kept off-limits, where more compromising items lingered in catalogs labeled with polite, opaque descriptors. Scholars debate the motives: prudishness, a desire to construct a civilizational narrative that emphasized monumental achievement over quotidian brutality, and the politics of empire, where controlling the story of a colonized land reinforced a sense of cultural stewardship. Where allegations of suppression are made, historical accounts point to specific instances, letters, acquisition records, and curatorial notes that document such choices, though the scope and intent remain subject to scholarly interrogation. The Feast of Drunkenness occupies the center of the ritual flashpoint. Descriptions in Greek observers and in later Egyptian chroniclers blend mythic spectacle with social cleansing. The festival's logic, as reconstructed from texts and architecture, relied on inversion. For a brief span, ordinary hierarchies loosened.
Ritual role players enacted forms of loss and recovery meant to renew the community's contract with fertility. Beer and wine were distributed in abundance. Masks and processions moved along routes that threaded between temple thresholds and city streets. The liminality allowed for controlled disorder. Rites of humiliation and release designed to return individuals to their civic places with renewed obligation. Yet in the passage from ceremony to lived consequence, the boundaries blurred. Alcohol-facilitated possession was interpreted as divine, but it could also be weaponized. Priests who endorsed certain behaviors could assert spiritual sanction for actions that, without that sanction, would have been punishable. Eyewitness accounts translated by historians speak of scenes heavy with music and motion, of participants whose agency was complicated by intoxication and communal pressure. Reconstruction of the feast suggests a simultaneous public catharsis and a private tragedy for those positioned at the festival's margins: children, dependents, and the coerced. During the festival nights, quick staccato rituals and chants replaced quotidian discipline. Priests invoked myths about the god who dies and is reborn, paraded symbols of the Nile's bounty, and directed
Ritual participants towards set outcomes. For some households, the feast might have functioned as a temporary redistribution of social roles, an officially sanctioned loophole where temple functions could be performed by temporary appointees. For others, it may have been a cover under which exploitative acts took place, justified by appeals to renewal. The point is not to accuse ritual of singular intent, but to show how structures that framed sexuality as civic duty could also facilitate abuses of power. Rapid sentences can capture the sense of chaos: drums, wine, masks, thresholds crossed and then barred. A child moved from a home to a temple precinct and back, altered in ways the official narratives would not record. The political aftershocks are visible in the archaeological sequence. Hellenistic rulers and later Roman administrators introduced reforms that changed temple funding and personnel patterns. Some rites were curtailed or reframed to fit imperial agendas. As central authority shifted, certain local practices were suppressed or transformed, sometimes by elites who sought to replace communal ritual with standardized cults. This process did not simply eradicate traditions, but often drove them underground or altered their social footprint. Survivals and clandestine continuities appear in marginal textual threads and in material practices that morph in response to new regimes. Long-term trauma manifests not just in bones and burial inscriptions, but in altered folk practices, in traces of secrecy passed down through households, and in the silences of public memorialization. The ethical charge for modern stewards of the past is twofold. First, to acknowledge that sanitized displays and euphemistic museum labels can perpetuate erasure. Second, to handle sensitive materials with a balance of scholarly rigor and compassion for the living descendants of those histories. Some recent curatorial efforts have begun to reopen drawers, to publish contested papyri with fuller context, and to engage descendant communities in interpretive decisions. These initiatives are uneven and often contested. Documented moves to declassify previously withheld materials coexist with cases where institutions have deferred to prudence or commercial pressures. The human aftermath is not only academic. For survivors, whether those described in papyri as later life petitioners or those indirectly affected through lineage, the past is a ledger of bodily memory and social consequence. Trauma can pass across generations through altered caregiving practices, through the poverty that accompanies households burdened by ritual levies, and through the silent inheritance of stories that could not be told publicly. The cloth-wrapped mummy is a metaphor for these layered retentions. Beneath pristine linen may lie scars of life that official inscriptions do not name. Returning to the embalmer's ledger, there is an entry that has drawn the attention of contemporary researchers. It notes an object, an ivory plaque with a partially effaced relief, removed from a temple inner chamber and sold to a private collector in the early 19th century. Papers that later surfaced in a European archive mention the object's sensitive subject matter and a decision to consign it to a private collection rather than to publish it. The record is sparse but revealing. A documented case, among others, where choice, taste, and power shaped what the public would see. The plaque itself, now dispersed in references rather than viewable form, becomes a symbol, the mummy wrappings in which some histories sit unseen. Scholarly inquiries in recent decades have tried to trace such objects' provenance and, where possible, to restore them to the interpretive corpus. Digital projects, open access initiatives, and cross-institutional collaborations have helped bring to light papyri once held in private hands. At the same time, cautionary debates continue. How to present material that testifies to abuse without re-traumatizing audiences or sensationalizing suffering. Best practice emerging from those debates emphasizes contextualization, survivor-centered framing, and transparent citation of sources that allows readers to follow claims to their evidentiary roots. Even as archives open, the moral question remains: how to reckon with practices that were simultaneously religious language and mechanisms of control. The answer is not solely archaeological. It requires ethical historiography and public engagement that does not turn victims into mere illustrations for a sensational narrative. The work of recovery is painstaking, assembling fragmentary papyri, re-examining osteological datasets, rethinking curatorial taxonomies, and listening to descendant communities. Night falls over the necropolis in the reconstruction one reads on the back of a catalog card. The embalmer places the ivory plaque into a box he will not sign his name to, then tucks a descriptive fragment into the ledger margin, an apologetic line, a note that the item's imagery may be misunderstood if seen without context. That margin note, redrawn now by modern researchers, becomes an index, not only of what was hidden, but of the choices that concealed it. The plaque's path, from a temple threshold to a collector's drawer, from a private archive to a scholar's footnote, traces a route by which the past was sanitized. Across the river, on starlit banks where the reed boats rock, other traces persist. Songs whose verses allude to lost rituals, small tokens placed at doorways that echo older protections, ritual phrases misremembered as lullabies. These are the forms by which memory survives when official narratives prefer omission. The implications for historians and for the public are clear. There is a duty to make visible what has been shrouded, to distinguish between the pattern and the anecdote, and to present victims as people with dignity, not as props for shock. Whenever allegations of past suppression are made, the responsible path is to point to documented records, letters, inventories, curatorial notes, and to let those documents be the basis for critique. Sensational claims without provenance do a disservice to the people whose lives are under study. The river continues in its slow logic, indifferent to the ways humans sculpt stories upon its banks. Yet we are not indifferent. The archive of bones and papyri and ledgers calls for an ethical historiography, one that acknowledges pain, that resists erasure, and that refuses facile conclusions. It is only by piecing together fragmentary evidence, by qualifying assertions, and by centering the lived consequences for the vulnerable that a fuller picture can emerge. In the embalmer's ledger, in the margin where the ivory plaque is listed, there is another notation, this one more recent, added by a 19th century hand who had a habit of crossing out words he found indecent. The line is half obliterated. Modern researchers, tracing that hand across multiple documents, have mapped a pattern of editorial erasure. The plaque's displaced image, the crossed-out margin, the ledger's quiet witness. Together, they form a puzzle about what we choose to preserve and what we choose to forget. The puzzle is not yet solved. Following the plaque's provenance leads to more questions about collectors, curatorial ethics, and the lines between prudence and concealment. The next step in the investigation turns from the field to the archive, from the tomb to the drawer, and points toward letters that may finally name some of the hands that decided what would be shown and what would be folded away. They found the letters folded inside the ledger between folios that had once been thought blank. The paper was brown with age, its watermark faint, the ink made of a hand that slid between neat clerkly strokes and the quick, almost furtive scrawl of someone writing under pressure. One letter was headed with the name of a known dealer who had trafficked in Egyptian antiquities in the mid-19th century. Another bore the stamp of a provincial archive and the looping signature of an embosser who signed cash receipts for temple goods.
A penciled note in a later hand marked the bundle, ivory plaque, see Catalog 1847. Reading them in the reading room, with the desk lamp casting a small circle of light on the table, the team let the papers supply a chronology that the ledger had only hinted at. The first letter, dated in the reign of a provincial high priest whose name survived in the margin of other receipts, requested that an object of uncertain propriety be kept from public lists. A phrase, "for the sake of the sanctuary," appeared repeatedly, strikingly elastic in meaning. A second writer, an agent in a coastal city, replied that discretion would be enforced, that the object might be transferred to a private safekeeping until the season of pilgrimage passed. The tone was matter-of-fact. There was no moral wrestling on the page, only an economy of euphemism. Other documents were less circumspect. A memorandum from an embalmer's workshop stated clearly that certain plaques were removed because their imagery would "scandalize foreign eyes," a phrase that revealed anxiety about strangers and the emerging market of collectors arriving on steamers. A receipt from an English collector acknowledged a payment to "arrange transport discreetly." The crossed-out lines in the ledger, the 19th century hand who had defaced a phrase and xed a verb, were suddenly legible as acts of deliberate editorial shaping, not only of records, but of historical memory. Discovery did not lead to simple accusation. The letters revealed a tangled web. Priests anxious to preserve rituals, artisans under economic pressure, middlemen responding to foreign collectors.
Appetite, and local elites who saw in the removal of certain images a way of policing propriety. The marketplace and the sanctum were not cleanly opposed, they overlapped. What at first seemed like a straightforward concealment hardened into evidence of a more complex set of choices, some defensive, some opportunistic, some cynical. The ethics team convened in the archive's narrow conference room. They reviewed photocopies and transcriptions, mapping each named hand against the ledger, against shipping manifests, against donor records in museums across 2 continents. A genealogist on the team traced heirs of the collector who had signed the receipt. A conservator identified the glue used to mount the plaque in a Victorian frame that sat in a provincial museum's storage. A legal scholar sketched out the possibilities and the constraints, statutes of limitation, long-dormant export licenses, and the morass of 19th century transactions that might be legally defensible but ethically fraught. They also listened. The Riverside singers they had contacted, elders who still knew ritual fragments, came to the archive with hands that remembered other kinds of memory. They asked for the letters to be read aloud. When the clerk pronounced the words, "for the sake of the sanctuary," a woman who kept the House of Songs said only, "They moved what held our saying into another mouth." Her voice folded the paper into a living claim. This was not merely administrative mischief, but the displacement of patterns that had once protected and tended a people's mind of things. Conversations with descendant communities changed the shape of the project's options. Consultation made clear that recovery was not a bureaucratic ledger to be corrected. It was a moral practice that required consent, care, and a willingness to remain accountable for what the team might reveal. Some elders wanted objects returned if possible. Others feared that returning a plaque stripped of its ritual context would repeat the pattern of reductive display. They asked for controlled access, for educational collaborations, for ceremonies that acknowledged both the object and the harms visited upon those who had once tended it. A plan emerged, not a single decisive act, but a sequence. First, publish the primary documents with full provenance notes and facsimiles, so the ledger's gaps could no longer be treated as silence. Second, notify institutions where the plaque might have traveled, offering the research findings and requesting inventories be re-examined. Third, open a dialogue with potential claimants and custodians about restitution or shared custody. Fourth, design an exhibition and accompanying materials that centered survivor testimony, contextualized the object within ritual life, and made clear the archival lacunae and past erasures. Even as they mapped these steps, the team recognized the hazards of exposure. Publicizing names could initiate legal suits, scandal, or, conversely, a rush to hide other records.
It might also re-traumatize communities if done without careful framing. So they drafted a statement meant to precede any release, a commitment to center descendant narratives, to avoid sensational imagery in publications, and to provide contextualization that honored cultural meaning.
Rather than reducing it to evidence. At night, the archivist returned to the ledger and the plaque's descriptive fragment. She sat alone amid rolling stacks and let the quiet of the reading room evoke the necropolis mentioned on the catalog card. The ivory had been carved with hands now unknown. Those hands had been seen, bought, cataloged, and then erased in marginalia. Naming the hands who ordered the erasures would not restore the songs that had been silenced, but it would alter the ledger's authority. It would transform a single crossed-out line into a public admission that choices had been made, choices that could be named and thus judged. Outside, along the river, reed boats rocked beneath lamplight, and children practiced verses whose meaning had drifted toward lullaby. Inside, the letters lay open like small liturgies of bureaucracy, petitions, receipts, directives. The archive, once a place of inurge material, began to act like a community, a space where accountability could be framed, where the traces of concealment might be turned into a starting point for redress. The work ahead would involve lawyers and curators, elders and conservators, and a stubborn patience with the kind of slow justice that archives afford. They boxed the letters for transport, with 2 copies to remain in the archive and 1 copy to be sealed with a note for the museum whose storage records matched the most likely route. The photograph of the plaque, taken years earlier by an amateur collector, was re-examined under raking light and revealed a chip that matched a notch in an embalmer's account. Small things fit together with the inevitability of a map being drawn. Ledger to letter, letter to receipt, receipt to frame. Naming the hands that ordered erasure promised consequences that would echo across committees and exhibit halls. It would also, the team hoped, open space for practices they were only beginning to imagine, dialogues that attended as much to sound and song as to object, curatorial choices that honored the living line of memory, and conventions that treated testimony as evidence in its own right. They turned out the lamp. The river kept its slow logic. The archive locked its doors. Between the two, the letters waited, brief combustions of ink that would force the institutional air to stir. The investigation was no longer simply a reconstruction of provenance. It had become a public reckoning, a turning in which the ledger's once invisible hand might be called to account, and the plaque's journey might be redirected toward a future that refused the old habit of concealing harm. In the week that followed, the reading room became a field office. Maps were pinned to corkboards, color-coded threads tied receipts to shelf marks. The ledger's ink was photographed, enlarged, scrutinized, until the hairline of a loop revealed a single clerk's flourish repeated across 2 entries. The archivist slept poorly, rising at dawn to cross the river and stand in the stacks while the light moved its slow arc across the spines. Her hands learned again the weight of a page, how paper remembers fold lines, how a crease can name a journey. They began, as promised, with controlled disclosure. The team sent the facsimiles to a narrow circle: a conservator at the museum whose name had been on the old shipping docket, an attorney who specialized in cultural property and had once mediated claims between municipalities and collectors, 3 elders from communities whose oral histories had quietly referenced a shrine by the river. The letter that accompanied the facsimiles was careful in tone. Not accusation, but invitation. Not demand, but a proposal for truth to be shared and for stakeholders to decide next steps. Replies arrived in different tongues of restraint. The conservator answered first, with a clinical report of condition and a willingness to allow in-person examination if the team would sign a confidentiality agreement. The attorney wrote a circumspect note about statutes of limitations and precedents, and warned that the more public the claim, the more complex the legal landscape would become. The elders replied with a mixture of gratitude and menace. Gratitude for being consulted, menace in the way that grief can be expressed: sharp, vigilant, refusing to be made tidy.
The first joint meeting was held in a church hall near the river, a space chosen for its neutral wood and the long bench that could seat many. The archivist and 2 colleagues arrived with boxes of reproductions and a small projector. An elder from each family line came as well, some accompanied by younger relatives who recorded the evening on their phones, an uneasy detail the archivist noticed but did not comment on. At the head of the room, under a bare bulb, the projected photograph of the plaque filled the wall, grainy and luminous. An elder whose hair was braided with a ribbon of blue spoke first. He did not ask for the plaque by name. He asked instead for the story. Where had it been? Who had touched it? What had been said when it left the place of ritual? His questions were not legal ones. They were the questions of a people wanting to know what had been taken from them beyond the object itself. Another elder spoke of the songs their mothers had taught them, songs whose rhythms matched the carved motifs. A woman in the back, her voice small, said the plaque had accompanied a healing rite. She had seen it as a child when a neighbor's fever broke that night by the light of the shrine lamp. The archivist read aloud the ledger entries. She read slowly, letting the marginalia rest in the room. Dates, the names of intermediaries, the crossed-out line that had once erased the record of transfer. When she reached the clerk's flourish that matched the embalmer's receipt, one of the elders reached for her hand without thinking. The room stilled around the whisper of pages. But the meeting was not a ritual of affirmation alone. A representative from the museum had come, young and measured,
carrying a thick folder of acquisition paperwork. He spoke of good faith purchases, of donors who had believed themselves to be the object's rightful custodians, of conservation practices designed to preserve. He offered, anxiously, the possibility of a loan that would allow the community storytellers to present the plaque in situ while the museum retained legal ownership. His language attempted to translate atrocity into policy. Not all ears received policy kindly. A man with a scarred knuckle, one of the elder's sons, said that a loan was another act of containment, a continued decision to hold the sacred at arm's length, to require the living to ask permission from institutions that had profited from absence. The room split in small, righteous arguments, between those who sought reconciliation through shared custody and those who insisted upon outright return. The archivist listened, annotating as the debate moved like a current down the length of the bench. Outside, the river made its slow, late argument against lamplight. Inside, the ledger's marginalia hummed with consequence. The team promised 2 things at the end of the meeting. 1, to publish the provenance documents with the contextual statement they had drafted, an ethical preface to accompany the facsimiles that would insist upon survivor testimony as interpretive authority. 2, to convene a mediation that would include legal counsel, the museum's representatives, and a panel of elders empowered to speak for descendant communities. The announcement did not remain local. An academic who had been invited to comment posted a careful piece to an online forum, asking colleagues to weigh in on cataloging practices and circulation networks. A journalist from the city paper reached out soon after, seeking comment on the ledger and the possibility of restitution. The archivist felt the familiar tug of 2 truths: that elimination can be instrument of justice, and that illumination also strips context in its glare. The museum's initial caution hardened into a defensive posture. Its director issued a statement, emphasizing the institution's commitment to preservation and public access, while declining to answer questions about provenance practices in prior decades. The press repeated phrases, murky acquisition history, legal gray area, and the echoes began to set like frost on the institutions involved. The conservator who had once agreed to an exam withdrew her earlier offer pending institutional counsel, citing procedural constraints. Under pressure, the team recalibrated its plan. They convened a confidential roundtable, a legal advisor versed in repatriation statutes, a mediator skilled in cultural disputes, 2 elders chosen for their wide respect among the different families, and a representative from a regional heritage council. They laid out scenarios: litigation, which could compel the museum to open its archives but might also place artifacts at risk of being sequestered by courts; negotiated transfer, which would depend on goodwill and careful conditions;
or a hybrid arrangement involving periodical loans, digital repatriation measures, and co-curation agreements that would place interpretive authority back in the hands of descendants. Digital repatriation alone is a poor consolation, one elder said. We have ancestors in
the ground who expect bodies of ritual to be back in the hands of the living. To see the image on a screen is to see an echo without a voice. The legal advisor, who had handled several complex claims, nodded. Courts can recognize harm, but they move in precedent and property law, she said. Sometimes the remedy is not legal but social, the museum's willingness to cede moral authority. Getting that willingness will require pressure. Pressure, public and private, arrived with a slow, unpredictable rhythm. A small protest formed outside an upcoming fundraising gala at the museum. A letter signed by several scholars arrived insisting on the necessity of transparency from cultural institutions. A trustee sent a curt email threatening reputational damage if the matter were blown up in the press. The archivist watched these ripples and tried to keep the team's work tethered to the original intent, to name what had been done to the ledger's language, and to find ways, however partial, to restore the plaque's meaning to those whose songs it had once accompanied. One late afternoon, as rain began to thread the city in thin silver, the archivist walked to the museum's storage facility with two elders and the conservator who had at last agreed to open a crate. The space smelled of dust and wood polish, and the light was tempered by skylights high above. The crate was wooden, banded and labeled in a hand that had been neat in a different era. The conservator's gloved hands worked with practiced caution, soft brushes, magnifying glass, the rustle of cotton. When the plaque was lifted free, it bore the familiar notches and the faint patina of handling. It also bore a thin line of adhesive, a duplication of small repairs that had been done perhaps to steady fragments for display. The elders stepped forward, eyes narrowed and then moist. One of them, older than any who had sat in the church hall, placed a fingertip near a carved motif and did not touch the surface directly. But the gesture was enough. Memory moved through him as if the object had been a chord calling a long-held note. "She remembers," he said, voice low. "She remembers the names of the songs." The conservator's face, usually composed, softened. "There are residues of organic binding here," she murmured. This was displayed in a context where ritual offerings were placed against the underside. We can date the adhesives and possibly the fiber that remained. For a moment, the room was a place where laboratory work and lineage coexisted. The archivist found herself thinking of the ledger's crossed-out line as an incision that had left a scar. The question before them had become about healing rather than simple restitution. How to make an institutional wound visible enough to be acknowledged without making the people whose lives it had touched bear the brunt of the witnessing. They left the storage facility with an agreement to continue conservation work and to prepare a joint statement announcing the find and the upcoming mediated session. The elder who had placed his fingertip on the plaque's carved motif walked to the door last, pausing to look back. He folded his hands and spoke a sentence in his language that the archivist did not wholly understand, though she felt its cadence like a tide. When the mediated session convened, the room had the brittle calm of those waiting for verdicts that are not strictly legal. The mediator opened with neutral reframing. This was not simply a dispute about a thing, but a negotiation about memory, identity, and institutional responsibility. The museum's lawyer explained their legal stance. The elders explained what the plaque meant to their rights and why its absence had been a quiet wound. The archivist presented the ledger, the facsimiles, the photographs, and the conservator's report. The room listened as the ledger's crossed margin was read aloud, and as the conservator detailed the material traces that linked the object to ritual practice. Outside, the river remembered how to make it sound through rain. Inside, there was a tide as well, fragments of past choices becoming visible and, by their visibility, capable of being responded to.
The mediator proposed a phased plan, an immediate temporary custody arrangement for ceremonial use under conditions set by the elders, a formal covenant for shared stewardship that would place interpretive authority with descendant communities for any public display, and a public acknowledgement by the museum of the erasure recorded in the ledger, to be included in the museum's permanent records. The lawyer cautioned that the covenant would need teeth, legal instruments that translated moral agreement into enforceable action. The elders insisted that any legalese must be drafted with translators present, so the spirit of the covenant would match its letter. It was, in the end, a compromise born of pressure and of the strange accumulative power of ink. The museum agreed to the temporary custody and to draft the language of shared stewardship. The team agreed to delay broad publication of all primary documents until the covenant's wording had been tested. The elders agreed to allow conservators to undertake necessary stabilization to prevent further damage during ritual use. They shook hands with a ceremony that was neither triumph nor defeat, but a careful reallocation of responsibility. After the session, the archivist returned to the reading room. The ledger lay on the table like a patient who had just spoken. She ran her thumb along the margin where the flourish had been, feeling a tiny ridge where the ink had been pressed hard. Responsibility, she thought, was a slow thing, and restorative acts seldom resembled the clarity of justice as imagined in headlines. They were, instead, a series of small reorientations, words placed where silence had been, permissions given where authority had long made itself sovereign, and the steady, often humble work of making space for memory to be heard. The river beyond the window carried on in indifferent patience. The archivist closed the ledger and, for
the first time since the letters had been boxed, allowed herself a small, cautious hope. The plaque's journey would not end with the day's agreement. There would be legal texts to draft, conservational protocols to negotiate, songs to be taught anew and perhaps recorded with care. But the ledger, no longer a flat, unquestioned record, had been animated into a tool for reckoning. It had become, by the act of naming, a point from which return might be possible. She walked out into the rain and down toward the riverbank. Under the lamplight, reed boats rocked as before. Children practiced verses, their voices rising and falling like a promise. The archivist listened to that sound, and in it she heard an answer that had no ledger entry. The work would be long, but it had begun.